Gemma, you just tell me when. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Tenement Talk. I'm Kat Lloyd, Vice President of Programs here at the Tenement Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for our conversation tonight on the people's tongue, Americans, and the English language. I am here live in our 1960s tenement apartment. In this living room on our tours, we often talk about how Puerto Ricans are shaping American identity in the 1950s and 1960s, and how language was such an important part of that. Tonight's conversation will look at the evolution of American identity through language. What are the pieces of literature, poems, speeches, rap lyrics that we can look to understand how American English has evolved over time and the people who have evolved it. I am honored to be joined by tonight's guests. With us, we have editor of People's Tongue, Ilan Stavans, and New York Times columnist and linguist, John McWhorter. As always, we want to hear from you. We've already heard from you a little bit in the chat. Keep it going, so please share your questions, your comments with us, and we will make sure to pass those along to John and Ilan. And if you're interested in learning about our upcoming events, please visit our website at tenement.org, sign up for our newsletter. These programs are really possible with your generous support. So it's a thrill to see so many of you here tonight. We hope you'll come for our next programs and our gala this year, as we have for the last 3 years. We'll have a virtual live stream where you will be able to watch along as we honor Lonnie Bunch, our founder, one of our founders, Anita Jacobson, as well as our real estate team who are helping us with the crucial preservation project in 97 Orchard Street. So that is on May 2nd. Register if you haven't, and please continue to support us in any way you can. So with that, thank you again for joining us. Enjoy tonight's conversation, and I will turn it over to John and Ilan.
John, it's a pleasure again to be in conversation with you now in this extraordinary place.
Here we are.
And I'd like to start by making a statement. There is no American English without immigrants to this country.
Nope.
They have transformed it, we have transformed it in radical ways. I'm thinking just for a second in a kind of science fiction way, of the English, John, maybe you can help us go back to that, of the English that first arrived 1607 to these lands, and how difficult it would be for us or not to be able to understand it.
Actually, we would not have trouble understanding the first people who came here, the first Europeans, because this is one of those factoids that I love to share. Those people did not sound like Downton Abbey and Harry Potter. They sounded kind of like the way I sound now. The posh British sound happened after 1800, and so that's when they started sounding that way. So the founding fathers did not sound like people on Masterpiece Theater, as easy as it is to think that. They did not talk like this. They talked like this. Yes. And so we wouldn't have as much trouble as we think. Their word meanings would have been somewhat different. Right. We would process them as having weird accents, because it wasn't that they talked like people in Harry Potter, but they talked like people from various parts of Great Britain where the vowels there were different then than they are now. So it'd be a little odd, but we wouldn't have as hard a time as we think.
We call them settlers, we call them pilgrims, we don't call them immigrants, though the concept of immigration is not that different. Any reflections that can come from you on these subtle differences in meaning? I'm thinking of a settler and pilgrim, immigrant, refugee and exile. These places were filled with refugees and exiles from these different parts, the Tenement Museum, but also people that were crossing borders or taking rafts. the hierarchy and the typography or the types of words that we would use are quite remarkable, and some of them are more charged than others.
Certainly. Yeah, I think we have to remember that if someone came here, if a European person came here then in the 1600s, chances are if they had had it their way, they would have been able to stay at home. They didn't come here because America already existed and was attractive with Disney World and hot dogs. They came here because they were desperate. And as a result, yeah, I wouldn't call them immigrants for the simple reason that the people who are already here and thriving and leading legitimate and long-standing lives, unfortunately, were not going to be here in large numbers for much longer for the reasons that we understand. It wasn't that the whites came and joined their culture, or if they did, it was for a very short time. Nevertheless, the first people who came here weren't just, say, jolly explorers.
Right.
They were people who were in a kind of exile or were refugees of a sense themselves. And now here we are 400 years later.
Now, I always find it striking and maybe also very meaningful and suffocating that the sonnet that welcome immigrants that is engraved in the plaque in the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty by Emma Lazarus, the new Colossus, give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, is in English. These are immigrants that are arriving from not all over the world. They are mostly arriving from Europe. They are arriving with in Italian, in Yiddish, in Russian, in German, in French, and at least hypothetically, one of the first things they encounter in terms of literature is a literature that they don't understand. It's in English, and it's a particular type of late 19th century English. Should the sonnet have been available to them in translation to make it more welcoming, more embracing, or that's a sensibility of today that doesn't quite fit into that period?
What a fascinating question, Ilan. You know, we do have to keep in mind that it's weird that English was the language, partly because why are you and I speaking this? Right. This is this language born on some windy island that nobody would have thought would have become the language that stomped all over the world. You know, why you speak English? Why in God's name am I speaking English? Then all these people come and there's this sign in English, and it's this fusty, flowery kind of English. But to tell you the truth, there's a part of me that figures that that was the way it had to be for better or for worse, because I don't know if I were an immigrant, if I would have wanted to see a poem saying, bring me your tired and your poor. Yeah. I don't want to be tired and poor. Or if somebody is going to call me tired and poor, I would rather see it written in Spanish or Yiddish, where it kind of seems removed. And so in a way, I don't mind, but I take your point. It was not translated. And so, for example, I remember the first time I went to the Empire State Building, and the last, I must admit, was in 1971, and the reason that I liked it, the only thing I remember, is that the brochures were in various languages. It was when I realized that I was a linguist that day. They did not do that at the Statue of Liberty, but I don't know if I would have wanted to see it. I don't want to be called tired and poor.
Tell me, what is the journey of John McWhorter into English? Where does your family lead? Where do you come so that we are now having this conversation in this language?
Another great question, Ilan. You do this very, very well. I'm going to try to do it myself. But I'm John Hamilton McWhorter V, and the first John Hamilton McWhorter was a slave. That's about all that's known about him. Probably he spoke either Wolof, Chui, or Congo. That's a guess. And so Wolof,
neither
the
of
language
which you speak.
No, I do not speak those languages.
Right.
It's been a long time. My parents, of course, spoke those languages, but they didn't teach them to me. No, I'm kidding. And so Wolof is Senegal, Chui is Ghana, Congo is further down in the Congos in Angola. And almost certainly, John Hamilton McWhorter's son would not have spoken those languages. And the weirdest thing that you see in plantation history is that he wouldn't have wanted to. His thought would have been, as he grew up in South Carolina, my language is English, not the African language, as he probably would have put it. There's one remaining photo of him, and you don't get the feeling he was interested in African languages. That's a person who was speaking English. And the history on the other side is a little bit less well known, but similar: Georgia, plantations, slavery, followed by people who were living under Plessy versus Ferguson and Jim Crow, but very much in English. It would have been a toggling between Southern Black English and English. Although, to give you detail that maybe is a tiny bit too much, but not, my father's father, John Hamilton McWhorter III, time goes by and people don't remember much about you. It's striking. The one thing well, there are two things people say about him. I'm going to leave out one. But the second thing that anybody ever says about him is that he sounded Caribbean. He had never been to the Caribbean. And it took me years to figure out the reason they think he sounded like the West Indies is because Black English had different vowels when he was born. Most Black people would have said coat instead of coat back then. That's why people from the 40s and 50s thought he sounded Jamaican. Nevertheless, he spoke English, and I'm pretty sure he would not have spoken anything else.
Do you imagine him feeling uncomfortable when somebody connected him with the Caribbean?
No, because I'll bet he didn't hear that during the prime of his life, because the cohort that he was the age of, they all sounded like that. I remember knowing some of them in their 80s and 90s when I was a kid, and it would have been processed as that accent. The islands, though, even the islands among many Black Americans of that age, are processed as something kind of exotic. If you're from the islands, you wear colorful clothes, you've got that quote-unquote funny accent. Human beings become very familiar with and consider their comfort zone to be the speech that they grew up around. What you heard when you were a kid, that's what you are, even if it was something foisted upon your predecessors by unjust processes. It's always like that.
Foisted.
Foisted.
Let me tell you how I am now speaking English to you. A sheer number of accidents needed to happen. I am the descendant of Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews who escaped pogroms at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania. The majority of them wanted to come to the United States, as had already members of their families, but immigration quotas were such that became impossible. And
because of the pogroms.
Because of the pogroms.
Right.
And because of the poverty. So it was a major upheaval taking place in the Jewish world. The vast majority of Jews lived in Eastern Europe, the Ashkenazi Jews. There were others in the Ottoman Empire and other in the Middle East. But this was a very large population. And before the Holocaust, that other major upheaval, the earlier one, is the immigration that comes to the United States, that goes to Argentina, that goes to Israel. And they intended, at least 3 out of 4, to come to this country. Yiddish speakers. My grandmother on my father's side was never able to make it to the United States because of those quotas. She was stationed temporarily in the Caribbean and finally made it to the port of Veracruz and settled in Mexico, where she found a Ukrainian Yiddish-speaking husband. And
how?
Because the Jewish community was already
coherent,
while incipient, coherent, and well organized, philanthropic. And what my grandmother did was that she promised never again. She was a full-fledged Yiddish speaker, but she, as I understand, spoke Polish, Ukrainian. She spoke a little Hungarian, Russian. But she promised never to use the Polish language again, in revenge, so to speak, for the abortion that she felt she was a victim of from Poland. And you would not get her to speak about that. Yiddish became the first language that many of the kids of those immigrants, and then they transitioned to Spanish. And I feel that Spanish was the language into which I accidentally was born, but immediately received this astonishing background of literature and culture. And it's easier for me to say that I was born into Spanish than I was born in Mexico.
Yeah.
And then I became an immigrant in 1985, and here I am, at first stumbling upon this language, and now I think it's by I feel. Do you feel an outsider in English? You don't.
No, it's all I've ever known. But is Don Quixote yours?
Don Quixote is absolutely mine.
It's yours.
And it's mine not only because I have read it assiduously and voraciously and maybe obsessively, but because I have translated it also into Spanglish. And as a result, I have become the target of all sorts of attacks.
You're a bad man.
I'm a bad man, and happily so. Let me ask you a question, John. At the very beginning of the Republic, there was an attempt to create an academy that would protect the language. John Adams, the second president, believed that if the language wasn't protected, that we should have an Académie Française, the equivalent, it would go literally to the dogs. And others believed, other founding fathers believed that it should be left to the people to shape it, to transform it, to allow it to bubble up. How different would American English be if he had indeed succeeded and we had a Real Academia Española but in English?
If Adams had succeeded in creating that academy, then today American English would be precisely the way it is.
Beautiful.
It would have had no effect whatsoever.
Because those
Adams
academies are
never.
irrelevant.
It's a bunch of people sitting around a table who don't have enough to do. Adams he was a starchy man, and we have to remember he sounded roughly like this. He did not have a British accent. And the funny thing is that he wanted to establish this, and yet in his letters to his wife, he would say "you was" instead of "you were." He and Abigail used "was" in that way because that's the way ordinary people used it. It was prescriptivism, this academy kind of thinking, that meant that one person with disproportionate influence in England said, well, it's supposed to be "you were," and too many people listened, and now even you and I are saying "you were." But no, that would not have worked, and it's one of the blessings of Americanness that this feisty spirit of ours means that there is no Real Academia of useless policing of English.
So what is the authority in the language? Who decides, John, that a word such as bad will mean bad, meaning something negative, and then switch into something good? Is this truly a democratic, popular and populist language in that we ourselves, both in every corner of society, shape the language and the language spontaneously comes to the fore? Dictionaries play a role in terms of authority, the teachers, the parents. If we don't have that academy, what's the authority that we have? And do we need it?
It's not authority, it's more like patterns of weather. It's things that pop up suddenly, and something may catch on, it may not. Sometimes there's an identifiable reason, sometimes there isn't. And if it catches on, it becomes part of the spoken language. Now, there are people who are policing the language, so to speak, from dictionaries. Actually, American lexicographers are rather tolerant. They're rather realistic. They allow that things come and become part of the language, especially these days. So it'd be easy to make fun of them, but no, they don't. They wouldn't deserve the charge. But really, language on the ground is always moving in the same way as cloud patterns. So, for example, imagine I have never looked into a dictionary for the definition of the word nasty, but you can imagine what it is, and it has only a diagonal relationship to the way we actually use the word. If Donald Trump says that Hillary Clinton is a nasty woman, what did he mean? What does a black teenager mean when she says that's nasty? It's something very specific. If I use the word nasty, it doesn't mean either one of those things. It's a word that's kind of moved. Abigail Adams wouldn't have recognized the way we use the word nasty, nor would we ever give it any thought. That's the nature of language, which is spoken, as opposed to scratching it onto a piece of paper, which is writing.
Yeah. So in your view, John, who becomes, I know you're a linguist, I am a linguist too, but who becomes a lexicographer? Where and why do people choose to catalog words, to look at the etymologies, to make, if they are as tolerant as you describe, and I absolutely agree with you. Merriam-Webster is not too far from Amherst, Massachusetts.
That's right.
And so I've spent some time in their offices.
And they're nice people.
They're wonderful people. Who is in charge of making American dictionaries? Is there a tradition of a certain type of American that goes into this?
I think it's a kind of person who has a literary bent and also likes to have their ducks in a row. And I think what they kind of like is the idea of taking a Polaroid snapshot of the way the language happens to be at a given time. That's not the most ridiculous thing in the world. We know what the language is like now. Wouldn't it be interesting to know how people were actually using language in 1950?
Yeah.
Which you can't really. It would be anthropologically interesting, just like, frankly, this recreated space that we're sitting in now. And so I think it's that kind of person. My sense of lexicographers is that they are literate fans of language in general. They are not people who are wishing that the dictionary was some sort of academy. But yeah, it's quite a job because there are a lot of words.
Oh my God.
It's easy to think that there are only 600 words. There are more than that.
Any sense of how many words are there in the English language?
Depends on what a word is. So for example, make up.
Yeah.
You put makeup on your face, right?
Yeah.
Then two people can make up. They get along again. Right. You can make up for something that didn't happen before. You can make something up out of your imagination.
Of course.
Make is a word. Up is a word. Is make up 3 words?
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of
But the
thing.
dictionary would have it as one.
Some dictionaries would have all of those meanings.
Right.
Many would maybe only catch one. But the truth is, what I just showed is that make up is 4 words,
Yeah.
really. It's just that they're all pronounced rather the same. So it's hard to say how many words there are. Do you include proper nouns,
Yeah.
etc.? A language that's only spoken so that it's only what's in people's heads, spoken by people living lives, using the language to its full resources, but not able to make a book that has things in it like Ruth meaning mercy.
Yeah.
Ruthless means, he had no mercy. Ruth means mercy. No, it doesn't. But that's in the dictionary because at one point it did. A language has maybe 70,000 words. That's
70,000?
That's what you need. That's 70,000.
And do you think that French has 70,000 and German has 70,000?
They have more.
They have more.
Because you can
I
keep
would have
them in
thought
the big
the
book.
opposite. I think English has more.
You mean than them?
Yes.
It's such a hard thing to say. A French person wouldn't want to hear
Of course
that
not,
they
but-
don't that they don't have
Among us, we don't have to.
as many words. Nor would a Spanish-speaking
Right.
lexicographer want to hear this.
But a language that has been in the age of empire and colonization, a language that has gone out of its boundaries, its original boundaries, into other parts of the world, is a language that devours, that borrows, that lends, and as a result, it's a language that is in constant expansion. It's elastic. It could also break at some point, like Latin broke at one point and became the Romance languages. And the languages that stay home are, I would assume, smaller in number, but it's a very hard. But this brings me to...
Well, I want to ask you a quick
Sure.
question. This is a genuine question. English,
Yeah.
help. Help me. Give me aid. Aid me. Assist me. Those are 3 different shades of meaning. Now let's go back to help. Help me out, which implies that you deserve the help. Nobody has to tell you, but you learn that. Succor, S-U-C-C-O-R. So give me succor. You're in a painting or something,
Right.
but that's another one. And then give me a hand, which means that not only do you deserve it, but it's something very physical, not give me a hand with my taxes. All of those. Does Spanish have a similar array of words other than ayudar? I don't know. How many ways can you say help me in Spanish in normal colloquial Spanish?
In normal colloquial Spanish,
Which means
and-
no
and
sucker.
Spanish is spoken by 450 million people. So there's the Spanish from Colombia and the Spanish from Argentina and from Cuba, etc. And each of them, though sharing elements all across the
Many
continent,
Spanishes, yeah.
there are also nuances, and particularly when it comes to daily words or words that refer to food or words that refer to sexual parts and words that end up becoming metaphors. But in Spanish you would have ayudar, apoyar, contribuir, but you don't have, as you were mentioning, and this is because of the root of the English language, the compound words that you were kind of fracturing or adding
Right,
in
help
the
out.
dictionary.
Right.
But this is because the modern standardized languages are incredibly fertile when it comes to synonyms, antonyms, and give place to metaphors and allegories and all kinds of dimensions. So that in poetry you can have a combination of these words, apoyar, contribuir, and the imagination of the reader will go in different directions.
Of course, of course.
I want to bring it back, John, to the question of immigration. I'm not into accounting. I don't know why today I'm asking you all these number questions.
That's okay.
But I'm thinking of the contribution that immigrants have given or have added to American English, and it's enormous. Of course, one can only think of I don't know, hundreds of words that come from Spanish, hundreds of words that come from Italian, that come from Yiddish.
Certainly.
You don't have to be a Jew to know many of those words anymore. Chutzpah,
Schmuck.
bagel, schmuck,
Right.
the same thing with words in Spanish. And certain words of immigrant groups in some ways become fossilized into the English language,
Yeah.
like those words.
Yeah.
And is there a pattern there? How would you reflect on this contribution that immigrants give into the language when, after a certain level of assimilation, those words no longer belong to that group? They belong to just about everybody, and maybe they lack roots, or they are nostalgic in some way?
I think a lot of it is that immigration comes with people contributing new things to the culture.
Yeah.
And as often as not, the new concept or the new object will carry the name from the language. And so you bring in that new word. Earlier English had a way of assimilating words more in terms of sound than now. We're better now at least trying to approximate foreign words coming in. But American English used to just eat a word up. It used to be that Hawaii was called Hawaii because that was just easier to say. And it used to be that you would talk about raviola is another one, as opposed to ravioli and things like that. If people had talked about feng shui in 1910, it would be feng shui or something like that. Now we try to say feng shui as opposed to chop suey. I can barely pronounce how chop suey actually comes out in Cantonese. But a lot of it is that. And then sometimes it's just that people like the sounds of things. Yiddish with the shmo words, that's fun. You want to say schmuck, you want to say schmeal, and so those things tend to come in. And then also humor helps too. And so it's said, I've never been able to nail this down, but it's said that when we say, so you want to be a doctor, apparently that's from Yiddish, and that's from Jewish comedians spreading it around.
Syntax, right?
And you want to say that, and it feels Yiddish.
Right.
And now nobody would think of it as Yiddish. So those things definitely happen.
You know, very often in these days of political correctness, and you often write about that topic
Is there really political correctness these days?
Delighted that we're into the
I'm going to have to go out and see if I can find it.
Somebody will start a sermon or a speech acknowledging the indigenous population, the names of the places, but seldom will the speaker say that the acknowledgement is being done in the English language and not in the original languages. In some ways, the survival of English, more than survival, the thriving of English represents the perishing of all the other languages. Are languages cemeteries too of the past?
It's pretty scary. I mean, there were 300 different languages spoken just within where the 48 states are now, the original 48. And they were often as different as English and Japanese. And I would venture to say that every single one of those languages was much more complicated grammatically than English is. And every single one of those languages had its 70,000 words. And today, there are maybe a few dozen of them hanging on. There's some wonderful attempts at documenting them and capturing as much of them as possible. But it's hard to capture a language between the covers of a book. The covers of that book are not going to capture the difference between help and help out, for example. And so, yeah, English and Spanish, to an extent, in some other places, and also partly in some parts of the United States, has eaten up those languages. They don't survive when people cease to identify with them. And the hardest thing is that once people aren't really speaking them, the languages are so complex that it's hard to teach anybody how to speak them again. It's difficult to revive those languages. So yeah, it's a linguistic tragedy. that?
There is also something that in linguistics, in philology, is called you know these terms better than I do, John, the interlanguage or the middle language. I'm thinking of Yinglish, not Yiddish, not English, but the step in between, Spanglish too, Chinglish, Franglais. But I'm not thinking of the language spoken by in certain borders where French and English coexist, or Portuguese and Spanish, Portuñol. I'm thinking of the step that the children of immigrants use in juxtaposing the immigration language with the receiving language, call it English, in creating something that is an in-between in the process of acquiring the English language. And there's a beauty to that. There's freshness to that, but there's also the feeling among immigrants that their children are not learning English fast enough, that assimilation means full-fledged, pure English. Reflections on those middle steps.
The middle steps are natural, and unfortunately, the parents and the grandparents don't always see that the kids often are able to use the new language, and then they also have this halfway language, which is a reflection of their bicultural identity. So languages are always mixing in that way because people are always mixing. And we often ask, why are people code switching? Somebody might ask, why is there Spanglish? But then again, English took on a massive amount of French words after the Norman invasion, and the only question would have been why that wouldn't have happened. You know, there are many French people around. So why wouldn't there be Spanglish? The question would be how Spanish would have stayed quote unquote pure, whatever pure Spanish is, once it was here. Our brains are on writing, and writing tends to enshrine arbitrarily chosen standard varieties.
It does.
And so we think of that as the real language and anything else as a random departure. The departures are often most of what language is among most people, and we tend to dismiss it all.
On the other hand, John, and this is to further the point that you're making, there are hybrid languages, and I'm thinking of Yiddish right now, that started as a mix of German with Hebrew characters, and then added all sorts of other elements from the Slavic languages, eventually French, Hebrew, etc., to become a fully standardized language, a language without a territory, a language without an army. There's that famous saying by
Weinreich.
The difference between a dialect and a language is
an army and a navy.
And a navy behind the language. And Yiddish never had that. But in 1,000 years development, it went from being a kind of kitchen language, a language spoken by women, by children, by the illiterate, not by the Talmudists, not by the highbrow, to culminate with the winning of the Nobel Prize in 1978 by Isaac Bashevis Singer, a kind of hush-push, bastardized Creole type of language. And one of the questions is, can a step language like the ones that we were describing evolve to become its own entity over a period of 200 or 300, whatever it is, years?
And we can see that it can. It's one of those things where you have to turn it upside down again. Jewish people are speaking a kind of German. Now, is it going to be that German stays the way it is among the people eating potatoes over in the village who aren't German? Or is it going to become a German that's full of Hebrew words and words from the Slavic languages that the Jewish people also speak? I think the answer to the question is pretty clear. And so then the idea is the thing that the Jewish people created an impure version of the thing that they're speaking over in Dusseldorf or something? I'm making up German geography, but you know what I mean. And the truth is that German started out as something that was weird, Proto-Indo-European. It's full of all these words that ironically might possibly be Semitic words. And so all of these are perfectly arbitrary judgments, and many of us might. Nothing against German. I've had a great time with German since I was a nerdy teenager, but Yiddish is frankly more interesting than German, including in its mixedness, including in its diversity, including in its Yiddishness. I would rather speak Yiddish.
I love that word, Yiddishness. Yes.
Yiddishkeit.
Yiddishness. Let me now switch back to a topic that I think you were with the I was and I were before. And I am going to bring in kind of a model from fashion in order to reflect on how American culture moves. My suggestion here, John, is that American culture moves by the mainstream stealing from the margins. There is something that rebellious young black men will start doing, turning the baseball cap around, putting the pants down for men, a certain type of hairstyle for women, and it becomes a statement of a generation or of a particular moment in history, and the middle class, which tends to be anxious about itself all the time, it eventually brings in those styles and incorporates them into Banana Republic and Old Navy and the Gap and so on, so that there is this constant infusion of what is being considered to be in the outskirts into the center as a constant movement of renewal, the tyranny of the young as well. I am fascinated by questions of how does gangster rap, for instance, or the spoken word poetry transform standard mainstream language, the pressure that we have?
There is a strain of being an American person that really comes alive in the 60s. Hints in the 50s, but it really comes alive in the 60s, and particularly the second half, which cherishes the gesture of rebellion. It might not be real rebellion, but you're supposed to have a little bit of the badass in you. That starts late 60s.
So you don't trace it way back to the Revolutionary War, to the 19th century. It is the late 60s.
Major jump then with the counterculture. And the idea is that to express yourself, you're supposed to rebel somewhat against what the previous generation did. And all of the talk about the generation gap that starts in the 60s and 70s, nobody talked about that in the 30s. The teenager was emerging as a concept in the 30s. In 1915, there was no such thing as a teenager. It was just somebody who was kind of too young. In the 1930s, there's this Bobby Soxer person. And of course, people would say, I don't know what they're saying, or something like that. But they did, and that teenager grew up and became them like 10 minutes later. The real gap starts with the counterculture. And I think that that's why it's at the point that you see something that's meant as a concrete gesture of sticking your middle finger up, such as the hanging pants or something 35, 40 years ago now.
Right.
And then middle-class mainstream people take it up as a way of sticking your middle finger up just a tiny little bit to show that you're an individual. That is part of the American spirit. So I remember seeing, and it was a long time ago, I'm 57, but this is not an old man thing. I remember when I was 21, I was in this city, I was in New York, I was on the subway, and I saw my first person where their pants were hanging down. And I remember thinking, that looks so stupid that it must be on purpose, and I guess it's a style, and I'm going to have to get used to it. And now I wouldn't look twice. But I remember thinking, that's supposed to look rebellious because older people aren't going to like it.
But it's supposed to.
Yeah, like it was deliberate. That person knew what they were doing.
Right.
And I figured, well, that must be the word meme wasn't being used that way yet. But I thought, okay, that's going to be the new statement. And it was. And so now there are people who do that just because they are healthy and living a life. I think that's normal, and that's what happens in language as well. And so
that's where I
therefore,
wanted to go.
Black English in particular seasons modern mainstream English among young people in a way that nobody would have expected even a generation ago.
And is that something that happens in the last 40 years much more than it ever happened?
Much more.
And
so, because it used to be that the people who would use some Black English in their quote-unquote white speech were jazz musicians. There was a relationship to recreational drugs. It was an unusual sort of person who jumped out of the mainstream white identity. Then, even as late as the 90s, when I was a grad student, there were studies being done of what was called, if I may, a wigger. And these were white kids who acted like black kids, and that was considered unusual. Now, that concept is gone because what the quote-unquote wiggers were doing is now just what probably most white kids are doing. The music they listen to, the way they walk. I tell my students at Columbia The way you guys talk to each other, the way you guys greet each other, the way you guys use the word bruh, the way you're saying, I'ma do something.
Yeah.
I say, your parents, and I say, I know your parents because I went to college with your parents. I'm your parents. I say, your parents, as cool as they were, didn't talk and carry themselves this way when they were in college. It has started with the past 2 generations. I find it fascinating.
Is Black English much more impactful on mainstream American English than Latino English, that Chinese American English, than any others, because of a sense of guilt, because of a debt, because of a dependency? Why?
It's a good question. I think it's the music. I think it's the power of rap.
Really? But the power of merengue and bachata and corridos and Tex-Mex is astonishing. Maybe not so much in the Northeast, but you go to Texas and in California and New Mexico.
Now I'm going to get in trouble, but
No. I mean, you're always in trouble. Don't
yeah,
worry.
I'm used to it. Rap is more powerful because it's easier to do. So merengue,
It's more simplistic?
it's frankly, well, it doesn't have to be, but to make a stab at it is easier. Merengue music, anybody can't play that. You have to have a little bit of ability to dance the merengue. I tried once, it hurt. Whereas with rap, to speak charismatically and brag
But
to a
is that
beat,
really, I mean, it's because it's easier that it has more influence?
and boys like it because you're bragging to a beat. Any boys anywhere in human history would have loved to do that, but it happened that starting in the 90s, that was available to all boys in the world. I've watched a person in New Guinea who didn't speak English at all. His language was Indonesian and then his indigenous language. I watched him rap, and he was using all the same intonations, all the same gestures, and we might as well have been in the rainforest. That's how much it has penetrated. And so, yeah, I think that there's a unique power to the rap genre, as celestial as the music can be and as complex as it can be. It starts with something relatively easy. Latino music, Latin music, I think is harder to adopt as your own, and therefore it hasn't had the same sweeping influence. That's my hypothesis.
Okay. Are young people, could we say that many more new words come from young people than from older people? We tend to become more conservative the older we become.
We do.
And that is because, and we protect the language more, and when we're younger, we are more liberal and
Creative. Yeah, it tends to come from young people. Not always, but young people are the ones who are where things really start. Often things start with young women, too. It's women who lead that kind of change, and then it jumps the rails to men, and after a while, people are graying and saying it. But yeah, it tends to be young people who are doing the new things. It's people in their 50s are not usually on the vanguard of life.
And this is not only American culture, but everywhere.
This
It is
is
the young who have the pulse of the language.
Urban stratified culture, yeah. Now, it's not necessarily true if we're talking about indigenous societies, different ways of living. But in terms of, if I may, first world stratified societies, is amazing how universal it is that what young women do has an effect. And it's not so much that young women are more creative or young women are pulling at the boundaries. It's that language naturally changes. Men are a little uptight. Men are a little bit less likely to give in to wanting to change things.
Go further on this. Why?
It's interesting. No one knows why. It's actually contested, but why is it, because it is, that the new things always come from young women and then men start doing it maybe 10 or 20 years later. Older hypotheses were that women have to prove themselves. How did it go? Women are less bound by the rules because they're less concerned with their reputations because they're at home. The men are out getting money, and the women are at home, and therefore they're less self-conscious. Obviously, if that was ever true, it hasn't been since roughly 1971, and I don't think that was ever the explanation. And so really, it's that women are normal. Men are somewhat less likely to give in to, for example, an emotion. We're not supposed to be emotional. We're not supposed to be overtly creative. We're not supposed to be extravagant. We're supposed to hold it back a little. To learn to be a man when you're about 14 is to learn to shut up a little bit and to not give away too much of yourself. If you don't do that, you're different. And I think with women, they're not restrained by that, and so they do new things more easily. So lately, for example, you can listen to people saying, no, it's for you. I don't know. That's going to become a new piece of language in about 50 years. And that is something young women started. Men are now, after 15 years, just beginning to do it themselves. In 50 years, there's going to be this marker of emotional connection.
And why 50?
Trying to give it long enough that nobody will find it interesting, and so it'll just be there.
But is it a span of time that allows for such a transformation to take place, passing from, I assume, 2 generations or a generation and a half?
To the point where people are old in doing it. And if it's old, then it's normal, of course.
Yeah.
So,
as a way to wrap things up, John, we began looking at the settlers and the pilgrims and how similar or different the language would be, the spoken language and the written language. And I agree with you, the spoken language would be quite similar. Maybe the written language would not be because of the
flowery, weird spelling.
Capitalization, and so on. But I'd like to now push forward into the future. Is English moving faster than ever before in the age of social media, the internet, ceaseless entertainment? Do words become accepted and thus also become obsolete much faster? And if we count 450 years into the past and say that's how they sounded, could we imagine how 450 years from now people would sound with that 50 times 8, 9 times?
Right.
Would it be much more dramatic, the equivalent of a millennium, because of the speed? It is true, for instance, in comparing Yiddish with Spanglish, both this hybrid languages, that Spanglish has evolved much more rapidly than Yiddish did. It has become accepted also much more rapidly. Maybe it's a pattern that is happening just all over, and makes one dizzy at the speed with which language. Imagine that your great-great-grandchildren are around and that you, like Rip Van Winkle, wake up. Would they understand you? Would you understand them? How different would it be into the, say, 450 years from now?
It would be pretty different if we're talking about colloquial speech. If somebody is saying, I'm going to walk in here and get you some milk, that's not going to change. But if somebody wants to sit and talk with their friends about something interesting, we only need to imagine. And I was like, imagine somebody from 1950 hearing somebody say that, especially the way nowadays kids often just say, yeah, it's fine. I was like, you were like what? You know, we know what they meant. Yeah. And he's all, that would be opaque to Teddy Roosevelt, for example. And that's just those things. The way like is used, I think Abraham Lincoln would shoot himself again. Listening, I shouldn't have said that. Because he didn't shoot himself the first time. Right. But he would have done it himself. Right. And that's because it would have sounded so utterly ridiculous. Yeah. Imagine more of those things happening such that, how long ago are we? 1,000 years?
I was thinking, no, only half a millennium, 450. I'm trying to go back and forth.
I see, the same amount. Yeah. No, it would be very confusing because things are happening very quickly. People are saying, oh, that was cringe. One of my students said that and I didn't know what they were talking about.
Do you get very impatient when your students say like? Or
No, I've told some of them, use like
or
all
your kids?
Very little. I must admit that as freewheeling as I am about like, when my 11-year-old started doing it, and it was full-blown, every 4 words, I started teasing her a little bit, and then I told her, and now the 8-year-old does it too. I said, you can say like every 2 words if you want to, but please, if you're in school, or if you're trying to be taken seriously, pull back on those, because there's nothing that you can do to keep it from sounding kind of illiterate to some people. So and I thought to myself, I'm becoming, the father from an Archie comic book.
Right, you're a prescriptive father, not a descriptive father.
I felt so fake about that. But no, I think like is great. And I've told my students, don't do it in your presentations. You can talk that way to me even during class. But I say like too. It's everywhere. Imagine more things like that in 450 years. It's going to make colloquial speech tough. But even The Wire listening to the people talk on the wire winded a lot of white people I knew 15 years ago. Imagine what's going to go on in 450 years.
Let's open it up to people both here.
Is this the part where you can gracefully take your water and drink?
Yes.
Okay.
We can both do that.
Yes,
Okay.
please take some water, and we'll wrap up the program with questions from the audience. I just wanted to see if anyone in the room has any questions. If not, there is some curiosity just Ilan, about your process for putting together the book. How did you choose what to include? And then sort of part two for you, John, like what was the most surprising, or what was a surprising part of this anthology?
Well, the anthology, The People's Tongue, Americans in the English Language, is, as I see it, a love letter to this language and to this culture. I am an immigrant. I've been here just over 30 years, and I didn't arrive with a solid English. And I feel that the English language has been incredibly generous to me. I have tried to enter it and make it feel as if it was home, a rented home, I don't own the language. And I wanted in this book to make a statement of how that language has changed from, by, and for the people. That is, how is it that John Adams argued in favor of that of that academy? And Thomas Jefferson said, no, we have to hear how the Caribbeans come and speak the language in a different way, and let that populate our language. I love the fact that at one point in Congress, early in the Republic, there was a motion to make Greek the language of this nation, and how different would we be?
Because Greek is just better. Right.
And then after that, just the beauties that this language has been able to produce, from Sojourner Truth to Abraham Lincoln to the poem by Emma Lazarus, and the many people that are non-natives who are very proud to enter the language and feel that it's theirs. There are pieces in the book, John, you've seen it, by Lucille Ball, and Lucy and Ricky Ricardo talking about how to pronounce a particular word, and she's correcting him, and he's making fun of the whole thing.
Take it easy. Right.
And also the tensions that we have had every so often by a president or a legislator telling us we need an official language that will establish the parameters. It's a big conversation, and what makes this language so interesting to me is that the conversation includes us all, even though sometimes we don't feel included, and that it is in English that the conversation is taking place, in an English that is infused with all these many languages.
Definitely.
And I am thrilled to have ended the anthology, 90 plus entries, with John McWhorter coming immediately after President Trump.
Because he and I are such good friends.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that was the, and I felt the need. There are pieces by President Clinton, and by President Trump, by Lincoln, and many others. And there is a very important statement there by former President Trump of how he used tweet to make a case for his obsessive behavior and for his policies. But in that, John, not the use, the abuse of the exclamation point. It would show up, and I mean, he stole it from young people on social media, but the exclamation point, as if it wasn't enough to see everything in capitals in a tweet by President Trump. Anything you have to say about the exclamation point as a
It's interesting. What starts as an extreme statement ends up bleaching. That's a linguistic process. And so it's at the point where I use the exclamation point to indicate a kind of a chirpy politeness in a way that I would not have even 10 years ago. So at the point where just a period looks chilly and formal. But that means that if you're going to actually indicate exclamation, you have to use at least 2, maybe 3. And with Trump, I mean, he's a septuagenarian infant, and so he has very passionate feelings, and therefore lots of exclamation points in the capital letters.
Yeah.
There are times when it seems like he thinks he's Benjamin Franklin with the capitals, but really he thinks of that as exclamation. I should say, Ilan, actually, that I teach your book, Spanglish, in one of my seminars, and students always eat it up with a spoon. I've never had any of them, even the ones who come from Spanish-speaking backgrounds, saying that they had any problem with any of it. But many of them say their grandmothers would, of
Yes,
course.
of
And
course,
so that's the
because of
grand
that
old
tension. Yeah.
story. In your marvelous new tome, which not only is it full of good stuff, but everyone should know it smells good. It's one of those books that has a good smell. If you open it up and
Oh,
put your
I love
nose in,
that.
that is part of enjoying a
Yes.
book. So it's fragrant. But also, I really enjoyed the piece by H.L. Mencken.
Yes.
And I know
Oh, I thought you would.
he's very white, he's
Yes.
smoking his cigar, but just the English that he talks about is always interesting because it's so far from us now.
Yeah.
He's sitting there saying, here is the American language. And I'm thinking, who?
Yeah.
And so you learn that even since him, things have changed so very much. And he had a very sharp eye.
Yeah.
And he was only looking at so much of American English. But even there you can see that
Astonishing.
people in this room, when this building was built, were hearing a different English, even if they were hearing mainstream American English, than what we are today.
Absolutely.
It's interesting.
I think we have a question from the audience.
Would you say that it's always been the case in this nation's history that words have been, from one group, have been co-opted and bastardized, even weaponized to be used then against that group? Or is that a more recent phenomenon? I'm thinking of, the word woke in current affairs.
Beautiful. You take it. You're
Words get pejorative, they get negative more than they get positive. And so it's something you can almost predict. The word reduce used to mean just to lead back to. You could reduce an army to its former status. You could reduce an army to shreds. It could go either way. Now we only use it the negative way. It's been shown, and say what this does about human nature, that words tend to get more sour over time. So that happened to woke. Woke started out as a relatively neutral or even praising word. And then about 5 years ago, it started its downward fall. I would say part of that is because there is a segment of wokeness that has hurt people, and there are people who are critical. And then there is the new social media, which makes these things happen faster than they would have. But woke became pejorative once it became mainstream. It used to be a very warm word. Now it's a slur. And that happened to politically correct, too. I am just old enough to remember in college, 84, a roommate of mine saying politically correct and meaning it as praise. That was he meant that this person's politics were the proper left-wing politics. That lasted about 4 more years, and then it became your PC. That's normal. Yeah.
Do you think that the word woke can survive and get a new incarnation in, I don't know, in another generation, rescued? I'm thinking of the word Chicano.
Huh.
The word Chicano originally was a negative word.
I didn't know that.
And then it mutated to become a form of empowerment.
Was it embraced?
Embraced.
Right.
And after that, a generation of young Mexican Americans in the 80s did not want to connect with the word because they felt it was their parents being too politicized. They wanted to become mainstream. And the word Chicano has made a comeback the way other words in the Latino community have. But then there's the X that I am as critical as I think you are, or maybe much more critical.
I've never criticized it.
I
say
criticize
it's not
it.
going to catch on.
Oh, it's terrible. It's a destruction of the Spanish language.
It's pretty ugly.
Yes.
Yeah, but I'm only saying
and
that
it's
here.
woke. Great. Back to you.
I think those are all the questions we have. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and hope to see you at our next virtual program. Thank you so much to John and Ilan.
It
course.
has been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilan.
Thank you.